I think it's a cheap way to award citizenship.
It is a tremendous draw for illegal immigration.
We don't give U.S. citizenship to mothers, we give it to the baby. And the baby is kind of innocent. It's like a blank slate.
And I think that we're all better served for that child to start their life in the United States on that footing of equality and inclusion that is the best of the United States.
Hey, it's Julie. Today on Top of Mind, we're tackling the debate over birthright citizenship. I know how hard it is to stay up on big polarizing issues when all we ever seem to hear is people arguing how they're right and the other side is terrible. What I want, and I think you probably do too, is thoughtful conversation so we can make up our own minds and become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates. So let's get started. This episode began for me at a naturalization ceremony I recently attended.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
It was just as patriotic and inspiring as you would imagine. The whole ballroom was full of local dignitaries, excited families, and teary onlookers, all waving tiny American flags, as 75 people from 34 different countries stood and took an oath of allegiance.
I hereby declare
A U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services official led them in the oath.
that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate.
So this was a really surprising moment for me. I knew that there would be some kind of pledge, but I did not realize that new citizens are expected to so dramatically renounce their allegiance to all other countries, including their place of birth, and swear to actively defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
They even swear to fight.
That I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law.
Here was a room full of people who had waited and studied and spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and government fees
So help me God.
for the privilege of taking this oath.
Congratulations, my fellow Americans.
Meanwhile, I got U.S. citizenship just for being born here. I suppose I'm technically obligated to the same things, but if a government official showed up at my house and asked me to swear that oath right now, I would be just a little bit freaked out. So I realized at that ceremony that I'd always conceived of citizenship as a mainly one-way deal. I'm born here, so I get it, and it entitles me to a U.S. passport, government benefits, and the right to vote in elections. But it doesn't make any special demands of me, aside from the things all law-abiding residents are held to, like paying taxes. The oath of allegiance for naturalized citizens, though, frames it differently. It's a two-way commitment of mutual consent and loyalty. And if that is the essence of citizenship in America, why do most of us get it automatically, without asking for it or promising anything in return? Well, it turns out that these competing concepts of citizenship, by mutual consent and by automatic birthright, have been in tension since the nation's founding. And the debate is not as cut and dried as the headlines might suggest. So we've collected a range of legal and personal views to help us explore the nuance today. The first thing to know is the way that we do birthright citizenship in America is not the global norm. Most countries, including all of Asia and Europe, pass citizenship from parent to child through bloodline. The U.S. is one of only about 30 countries, including Canada and Mexico, to grant citizenship by jus soli, or right of soil. No matter who your parents are, how long they've been here, or what their immigration status is, being born in America automatically makes you an American citizen. The only exceptions are children of foreign diplomats or occupying armies. For 150 years, birthright citizenship has worked this way in the United States. And the vast majority of legal scholars and civil rights advocates say it is a core part of America's commitment to equality and opportunity for all. But there have always been disputes about whether it's precisely what the authors of the 14th Amendment intended when, in 1868, they added this clause to the Constitution. Quote, All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. What's different now is we have a president trying to force the issue.
Look, birthright citizenship was, if you look back when this was passed and made, that was meant for the children of slaves. This was not meant for the whole world to come in and pile into the United States of America, everybody coming in and totally unqualified people.
That was President Donald Trump in the Oval Office in January 2025, about a week after he signed an executive order to restrict birthright citizenship only to children born to U.S. citizens or to immigrants with permission to live here permanently, so green card holders. Now, this is a big change, and 22 states immediately sued to stop it, arguing that it violates the Constitution. Ultimately, the question will end up in the lap of the U.S. Supreme Court, which has actually never specifically ruled on whether the Constitution guarantees birthright citizenship to children of unauthorized immigrants. Meanwhile, the courts are wrestling with whether or not states have to comply with the president's order during the many months it will take for the issue to work its way up to the Supreme Court. That's actually a whole other really interesting and important debate about separation of powers and rule of law. And we're going to cover that in a future episode of Top of Mind. So today, let's stay focused on the question of birthright citizenship. Now, here is the argument that President Trump and his allies are making.
I think when it comes to legal immigration, if you want to turn off the spigot, change this policy.
This is senior Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina on NBC's Meet the Press in January 2025.
I think it's a cheap way to award citizenship. You should not be a citizen simply because you were born here. You have to have some connection to the jurisdiction of the United States.
Note that he calls giving citizenship to babies of unauthorized immigrants a policy, as opposed to a constitutional right or mandate. And that's a big part of the argument, as Laura Reese explains. She's with the Heritage Foundation.
Universal birthright citizenship does not exist. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment to change this. It's been wrongly interpreted for decades. And the Trump administration is simply saying, okay, from here forward, we're going to correctly interpret 14th Amendment. So State Department, you shouldn't be issuing U.S. passports, for example, to someone unless they have a lawful permanent resident or a U.S. citizen parent.
What's the harm in extending universal birthright citizenship the way we have for more than 100 years?
One, allegiance to the country. Two, it is a tremendous draw for illegal immigration. If we want a lawful, orderly, and manageable immigration system, and supposedly that's what we want, then we want to encourage behavior to follow the law and discourage behavior to disobey the law. And if we continue to say, well, it's all right if you came here illegally and, had a baby here, right after you arrived, well, now you can't be deported. We're never going to get out of this problem. I mean, there's downstream effects too. That child, when they turn 21, can apply for benefits, immigration or otherwise, for the parent. And so that's where that term anchor baby comes from, as well as chain migration. So the intent of our immigration system is you can come here for family-based purposes or employment-based or humanitarian-based, but this has developed into a gross exploitation of our laws to the point where we now have this industry, birth tourism industry, where women will time their arrivals so that they give birth here in the U.S., and that is not what was intended. It demeans what is the most important immigration benefit that we can bestow on somebody.
Laura Reese is director of the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
So before we dive deeper into the legal and moral arguments on this, I think it would be helpful to put a human face on these concerns that opponents of birthright citizenship often raise, so-called anchor babies, chain migration, and birth tourism. Would you tell me your name?
Daniel Burciaga.
Daniel Burciaga came to the U.S. from Mexico 28 years ago.
Because I wanted a better life and an opportunity to do better job and for my family.
It was him, his wife, and his young son. And initially, he says they came to Utah as tourists. But when those visas expired, they stayed. A year later, their daughter Jessica was born a U.S. citizen.
As I became a teenager, I came into the understanding that once I became 21 years old, I could give them the opportunity. So other 21-year-olds look forward to it, to go to bars, go to clubs, and all that stuff. But for me, it was to give my parents that pathway to become residents and citizens.
Is it kind of guaranteed that you're able to give them citizenship if they're law-abiding citizens?
Yeah, well, it all depends on the lawyer and everything. But my parents have no criminal history. They don't even get traffic violations. Their whole record is really clear. So I kind of knew it was a guarantee from that point because of how good and honest people they are. So it was something I knew would happen.
I met the Burciagas on the day that it did. Daniela was one of the 75 people taking the oath of allegiance at that naturalization ceremony. He'd spent years getting his paperwork in order and months studying to pass the citizenship civics test. I asked him if he'd ever considered returning to Mexico during all the time he'd lived in the U.S. without authorization, facing the constant threat of deportation. He said no.
Because more part of my life I live here in Utah, and I like here. All my life is here. Yeah, I'm very happy to be more to the United States because I love this country.
And that day at the ceremony, he even swore to defend it. In return, he looks forward to voting and the clout that comes from traveling with a U.S. passport. He'll also have access to Social Security and Medicare when he retires from his factory job. So, how big a thing is this? Well, every year, about 3.5 million babies are born in the United States. Of those, somewhere between 250 and 300,000, so that's about 8%, are born to non-citizens who are living in the United States temporarily, as students or for work, or they're here without authorization. Birthright Citizenship makes those children eligible for government benefits like Medicaid and SNAP, also known as food stamps. So critics say unauthorized immigrant parents are tapping into those benefits through their children and then avoiding deportation by telling a judge that removing them would impose extreme hardship on their kids, who are U.S. citizens. That defense has worked for some in the past, but the Trump administration has, in recent months, sent a number of American-born children on deportation flights with their undocumented mothers. And that is very much on the mind of Christian.
Hello, my name is Christian. I am a writer and a mother and an undocumented woman living in America.
Christian didn't feel safe enough to use her full name with us. She has 5 children, all born in the U.S. The oldest is 9. Christian was a baby when she came to the U.S. from Mexico with her mother. As a teenager, she received DACA protection. That's the deferred deportation status created by President Obama. So people brought to the U.S. as children can legally study and work here. Christian did both of those things. And when she became pregnant with her first son in 2015, she didn't consider having him anywhere but here.
I mean, I grew up in this country. I gave birth to my son in the city that I grew up in. This is just as much as my home as anybody else's. And that wasn't even a thought that came to mind. I should leave, or I didn't think about any of that.
But it was a very difficult pregnancy. She had no prenatal care because she had no health insurance. She was a student working a part-time job without benefits. Unauthorized immigrants cannot get insurance on the Obamacare marketplace, and at the time she was pregnant, neither could DACA recipients like Christian. Many private insurers also won't cover unauthorized immigrants if they could even afford the premiums.
And I could not afford it at that time.
So she ended up having her son at a county hospital.
Because they said that if I gave birth there, that they would offer postpartum care at no cost. So I went there, and it was an awful experience. It was very traumatizing. One of the very first nurses that I encountered was very rude. She said, "How could you be so irresponsible and not have health insurance?" And I remember it took me back, and I told her, "Do you think that if I could have health insurance, that I would not have it? That I would choose to not have prenatal care or any kind of health insurance. And she kind of felt, I could visibly see that she was uncomfortable, and she did not apologize. I do regret going to that county hospital.
Once your son was born, did that change the way you thought about your future in the United States?
I didn't think about my future, but I definitely was able to understand. Really, that was the first time that it really hit me. Oh, I don't have access to anything in this country. It does not matter if I pay taxes. It does not matter if I work, if I'm educated. None of those things matter. I am not a U.S. citizen, and therefore I do not have access. And then also at the same time, kind of navigating the healthcare system with my son. And so he had insurance. We've had the same pediatrician since he was born. And so that was like, wow, I never had that when I was a child. And being able to see what it's like to get preventative care when you're a U.S. citizen and have access to those things that I never did as a child. I was sort of learning about all of the lack, and also feeling grateful that my son had it.
If you were to get deported, would you want your children to come with you?
That's really difficult because they have very intricate and important lives here. And I think that they would want to come with me, but I would not be able to provide the kind of life that they have here in my home country, in my pueblo, because I don't know it there like that. I don't know the culture. I don't know the language. I don't know anything. I left when I was a baby. So I would not know how to provide the kind of enriching life that my children have here in Mexico. I don't know if I would want them to come with me.
Do you think about the possibility that your son in another 11 years will be 21 and he, at least as of today, he would have the legal right to sponsor you to become a U.S. citizen? Is that something you hope for or even discuss with your child?
I don't. I really don't. I don't expect that of my children. I don't hope that my children will do that for me. I don't wait or long for citizenship. Obviously, I do feel the weight of, how they are criminalizing my community and the danger that that poses to me as a writer and as a mother. But this is just who I've always been. I don't even think about like how it would feel to get that one day. Because again, I think what we've learned from this administration is that citizenship is not a guarantee of liberty or safety or any rights.
Christiane, thanks for sharing your story. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie.
You can read some of Christiane's writing on La Cuenta, which is a Substack dedicated to undocumented immigrant stories and voices. In my reporting, and that of many others, it is rare to find unauthorized immigrants who came to the U.S. specifically to give birth to an American citizen. More often they come for safety or better work opportunities or to reunite with family. If they have a baby here, that certainly becomes an additional incentive to stay. But there is a subset of people giving birth in the United States who have no plans to stick around.
I mean, they don't work here, they don't have like relatives here, they just come here to give birth because that's legal.
What's the point then? And how is that legal? We'll get those answers next. This is Top of Mind from BYU Radio. I'm Julie Rose. We'll be right back to today's episode of Top of Mind. But first, are you ready to immerse yourself in the awe-inspiring world of nature? Then I recommend you listen to Constant Wonder. It's another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Join host Marcus Smith in riveting conversations with individuals whose lives have been touched by Earth's beauty and mysteries. Uncover captivating stories that shed light on our planet's wonders, from history to science and beyond. If you crave enriching experiences and a deeper connection with the world around you, tune into Constant Wonder. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. So just to recap quickly, an estimated 300,000 babies each year would be disqualified from automatic birthright citizenship under President Trump's executive order because the mother is either here illegally or on a temporary visa to study, work, or visit. Now, of that 300,000, roughly 7,500 are the result of birth tourism, where a pregnant mother comes from another country just long enough for the baby to be born an American citizen. That figure, by the way, is from 2008, which is the most recent estimate from the federal government because it doesn't track this regularly. When Kate Panova first stumbled on the practice of birth tourism in 2014, she kind of couldn't believe it.
This is like a rich town. There are like high rises on the beach with like private beaches, and it's like a lot of extremely pregnant women.
Panova had come to the U.S. from Ukraine to study journalism on a scholarship, and she went to visit a friend who lived in a Miami suburb called Sunny Isles Beach.
There were lots of Russian-speaking people in there, like from Eastern Europe. And as a journalist, I was like, wow. These ladies are like all 7 months pregnant, or like 8 months pregnant, like not a little pregnant, like something's going on, like which is weird. And I approached one of the pregnant ladies. I chased her on the beach and just like, approached her and said, hey, like, hi. So we talked in Russian. I was like, hey, like, what's going on here? Like, am I tripping? Like, why everybody's pregnant? And she was like, oh yeah, like, like everybody comes here to give birth. I was like, really? And I was amazed by this notion, and I'm not judgmental of it, and still am not, because it feels very American, you see, to me.
And Panova ended up making a documentary about it.
The United States was built by pioneers, by people who are taking risks, who are people who are breaking some rules a bit, you know what I mean, who are looking for a better life in pursuit of the happiness and a better future for the kids. And that's exactly what these ladies were doing.
And these women often don't have, obviously they don't have insurance in the United States, so they're probably paying, it's very expensive to pay for like a birth, probably $15,000, $20,000 out of pocket.
Yes, and those people are rich people, okay? They might be upper middle class for the United States, but they're like real rich people from where they come from. And most likely they, that's like one of the biggest investments in their life that they make for the kid. And in most cases, they come back home. They don't stay in the United States.
What benefit really was so valuable that they were giving to their child by going to the trouble and the expense and the risk of having their baby?
Freedom. America is a land of the free. But this freedom for the kids to decide and to be citizen of the world is what is so amazing. And how, we expect that if something bad happens, we will have a whole plane of Marines coming down to rescue you, or something. I don't know. You feel privileged. You feel like there's a whole government that will have your back. So one of the women who also gave birth to her kid here, she headed a nonprofit, the biggest nonprofit in Ukraine for cancer kids. And she would say I've seen so many sick kids and the parents who would go bankrupt and sell their kidneys, sell their apartments, do anything to kind of cure their kid. And in the United States, there are options. There's St. Jude's, So that was her motivation. This kid, if something bad happens with the health, at least the kid will have better chances in the United States. So this notion that the United States is the best country in the world. I don't know, maybe people in America kind of doubt it. But abroad, the American dream is still alive. And people really want that for their kids.
Okay, so the way she's describing U.S. citizenship as a kind of golden ticket that a rich mother can buy for her child without any sense of mutual allegiance is precisely why birth tourism is unpopular even among policymakers and pundits who support generous birthright citizenship. It just feels like it's got to be cheating, And Panova gets that. In fact, when she accidentally got pregnant a year after making her documentary,
I did feel like I was cheating. I went to see some of my family in other countries, when I was 5 months pregnant, and I was literally hiding my belly when I was entering the United States because I knew that if they were 100% sure that I'm pregnant, they would be questioning me on doing what is called a secondary inspection, making sure that I don't violate my visa.
She says she had always planned to return to Ukraine after her studies, but war changed that.
Giving birth to a kid and raising a kid in a country which is at war doesn't seem optimal to me.
Kate Panova has since married and had 2 more U.S. citizen children. They live in North Carolina. She owns a Russian-language news site called Rubik and runs a nonprofit called UA Welcome that helps immigrants navigate the visa and citizenship process. And even though birth tourism may seem a little like gaming the system, Panova thinks it should still be legal.
Absolutely. I think it's an amazing thing for our economy because people spend money here, in the United States. They come here, they buy lots of baby stuff, they pay doctors, they pay the hospitals, they pay restaurants and stuff. So I think that's very good for the economy. Now, the downside, I guess, is that it's really hard to distinguish between birth tourists and people who take advantage of the system and take free insurance and give birth.
All states are required to cover labor and delivery with emergency Medicaid for anybody who can't afford to pay, regardless of citizenship status. Some states also offer pre- and postnatal care.
So what happens is that this system is prone to abuse, unfortunately. And I do know people who abuse the system.
In 2020, the U.S. State Department clarified that coming to the United States to give birth and lying about that during the visa process is fraud. The Department of Justice has prosecuted some owners of birth tourism companies in the U.S., but motivated mothers continue to find ways around the rules. Last year, in 2024, Kate Panova became a naturalized American citizen herself. Her kids didn't help with that because they're not 21 yet. But her husband, who is Israeli, has opted not to become a citizen. Neither Israel nor Ukraine grants automatic citizenship by right of soil. And they disagree over whether the U.S. should.
My husband does feel like Trump was right with the executive order and, that babies shouldn't be getting automatically the U.S. citizenship. I would absolutely want all the kids who were born here to have it. I think it's fair if their mothers made it that far to give birth to them here. There's something about this journey, for a lot of people, which shows commitment to American values, if you will. Because it's about the baby, you see, it's not about the parents. The whole notion of giving the U.S. citizenship, we don't give U.S. citizenship to mothers, we give it to the baby. And the baby is kind of innocent. It's like a blank slate.
The argument Panova just made there is one that comes up over and over from people who support unrestricted birthright citizenship. They say that denying automatic citizenship to children born in the U.S. punishes them for the actions of their parents, leaves them vulnerable to harm, and fundamentally flies in the face of core American values like equality and opportunity. But suppose that baby ends up being harmed by the American citizenship he was given at birth. I know that sounds implausible, but it is Fabienne Lehag's story.
Je suis né à Mountain View d'un père qui est français.
So I was born in Mountain View from a French father who was in America for work and who met my mother there.
I spoke with Fabienne Lehag through an interpreter because he speaks very little English. He calls himself an accidental American because he was 18 months old, so still just a baby, when his parents divorced. He went back to France with his father, where he also had citizenship, since France does it through bloodline. And as a kid, Lehag said having dual citizenship felt kind of cool.
C'était le pays de la liberté. En tout cas, c'était la perception que j'en avais. Et donc, il y avait une espèce de...
I was the only American in our whole school, and I was proud of the fact that I was from this big, powerful country from across the sea.
But it didn't mean anything practically. His father told him, mistakenly, it turns out, that when Fabienne came of age, he would have to decide if he wanted to be French or American. And of course, he'd choose French.
There was no contact with my mother until I finally went to the United States and met her for the first time.
C'est à l'âge de 24 ans que j'ai été aux États-Unis.
And that was his one and only visit to the United States. He was 24 at the time. That was 15 years ago. Meanwhile, the choose if you want to be American letter his father said would come never did, because it doesn't actually work that way. Instead, Lehagre got a very upsetting letter from his French bank in 2014 that said, "You are in violation of U.S. law, and we're going to shut down your account if you don't fix this." See, American citizens, accidental or not, are supposed to file with the IRS every year, even if they have no assets or earnings in the United States. Lehagre had no idea, but his bank was now threatening him because of a new law in the U.S. called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA.
My whole world collapsed, essentially. I'm a law-abiding citizen in France, and I didn't know that I would have to be one in this other country.
Why not just renounce your citizenship to fix the problem?
Alors pour renoncer, il faut payer $2,350.
So the fee is $2,350 to renounce.
Yeah, no way, says Le Agre. Why should he have to pay thousands of dollars to be rid of something he didn't ask for and hasn't benefited from? Le Agre discovered as many as 300,000 Europeans were in the same bind. So he formed the Association of Accidental Americans to challenge FATCA and the renunciation fee.
As much as I was so proud to be American when I was a child, the last 10 years have really shown me that I don't want to be American anymore, or, never really wanted to be in the first place, and that I won't renounce my citizenship until the work that I've put in for the last 10 years is actually completed.
Ce qui est sûr, c'est que je ne paierai pas. Ça, c'est une question de principe. Je ne paierai pas pour renoncer.
And on principle, I will not be paying to renounce my citizenship.
Okay, so it had never occurred to me that having U.S. citizenship could be a disadvantage in any way. And it brings us right back to the idea of consent that we started out with. How do we justify requiring immigrants to give and receive allegiance from the United States when they become naturalized citizens, but we grant citizenship automatically to babies who are born here? Well, the answer to that lies in America's unique history of immigration and enslavement. So that's where we're headed next. I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. Hey, it's Julie, inviting you to embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Immerse yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. Join host Sam Payne and the live studio audience in laughter and delight as they explore a tapestry of tales. Tune in to The Appleseed for a family-friendly experience that sparks imagination and brings stories to life. It's your ticket to fun and creativity. Find The Appleseed wherever you listen to podcasts. Considering how big a deal citizenship and immigration are in America today, it is strange to realize the original Constitution and Bill of Rights included no definition of citizenship or how to get it. But that's because the American revolutionaries came from England, where citizenship at the time wasn't a thing. It was subjectship.
In which people were born in perpetual allegiance to the sovereign that had power over the territory in which they were born.
So think lords and peasants, or kings and their subjects. This is Rogers Smith, by the way. He's an emeritus professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania.
I think granting birthright citizenship is a great policy, and I've always favored it.
But back in 1985, Rogers Smith co-wrote the first scholarly book to question whether birthright citizenship for children of unauthorized immigrants is clearly granted by the 14th Amendment. And that book is still so influential that when we started trying to sort through this issue, the name Rogers Smith popped up enough in law articles that we were like, we got to talk to this guy with the two last names. So anyway, back to the American Revolution. One of the things Smith says the colonists intentionally rejected from English common law was that whole you owe the king your loyalty for life thing.
They also created a new form of government. Not monarchy, but a republic that was supposed to be a system of government by the consent of the governed, as it says in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Peter Schack and I argued in our 1985 book, the move toward government by consent should be understood to mean basically that individuals got to choose what countries they joined, but also the members of those political communities got to choose what newcomers they would accept, that it was a two-way street.
And to that end, Congress passed the first citizenship law in 1790, creating a process for immigrants to naturalize. But at the same time, America was a baby nation that needed to grow quickly. And what better way to boost your numbers than to attract immigrants and make their babies automatic Americans?
And they did it largely because it makes things much more manageable. It's administratively easier if we just say, if you're born here, you're a citizen.
So right off the bat, we've got this disconnect between the official policy of citizenship by mutual consent and the long-standing practice of granting automatic citizenship at birth. There was, however, one large group of people left out of both pathways to citizenship.
And that was persons born into slavery, and in some, but not all of the states, free persons of African descent born in the United States. And there was a tremendous controversy, not whether people who were enslaved could be citizens. Everyone recognized that was not the case, but whether persons who had been born free or became free, who were of African descent, could they be citizens of the United States? And that created a constitutional controversy that the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger Taney, tried to resolve in the Dred Scott decision of 1857.
The Dred Scott decision determined that neither slaves nor free blacks could be citizens of the United States. No naturalization, no birthright citizenship for their babies. So then there's the Civil War. Slavery is abolished. And in 1866, Congress, which is made up entirely of northern states at the time, passes a Civil Rights Act to deal with the Dred Scott debacle and grant Black Americans citizenship. The law said, quote, all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. But President Andrew Johnson basically said, Congress, hang on a second. There are not any southern states agreeing to this, for one thing. And what makes you think formerly enslaved people have what it takes to be American citizens? Plus, he says, you've written this so broadly that even babies of the, quote, Chinese and, quote, people called gypsies will be citizens. So he vetoes it. Congress overturns his veto, and then
supporters of civil rights felt they needed a constitutional amendment that strongly affirmed in the text itself of the Constitution that African Americans had citizenship.
And that is how we get the 14th Amendment. But it had slightly different wording from the Civil Rights Act. Instead of saying, quote, all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, it says, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and, here's the key phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
What that means was disputed within the Congress that enacted the 14th Amendment, and it's been disputed since. It had always been understood that children of diplomats in this country, or foreign sovereigns, should they be in this country, or invading armies that occupied American soil, if they had children in this country, those people would not be birthright citizens.
So this isn't just his opinion. It's part of the historical record. And the Supreme Court has affirmed many times that the children of diplomats and invading armies are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States.
It was also understood that members of the native tribes were not birthright citizens, at least as long as they were living in the tribes. And a lot of the discussion of the 1866 Civil Rights Act and a lot of the discussion of the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause focused on the tribes because it was clear that a majority in Congress did not want to extend birthright citizenship to persons born into the tribes. They were thought not to be Americans.
So on this point, says Smith, Congress was thinking about subject to the jurisdiction more in the context of allegiance than authority. The United States recognized Native American tribes as domestic dependent nations with their own governments, their own laws and courts.
There was a sense in which the tribes were clearly ultimately subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. That is, the United States claimed the power to rule over them. But at the same time, members of the tribes owed allegiance to their own authorities. They didn't give the United States their full allegiance. They were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in the same way as other inhabitants of the American territory.
Because they were subject to the jurisdiction then of their individual tribal governments.
Right.
So we heard President Trump earlier say that the 14th Amendment was only meant for the children of slaves. It's accurate to say that giving birthright citizenship to formerly enslaved blacks was a major motivation for the 14th Amendment. But Congress also clearly talked about who else would and would not qualify. No children of diplomats, no babies born to invading armies, and no members of Native American tribes. 40 years later, Congress reversed course on that last one and passed a law extending birthright citizenship to tribe members. But the framers of the 14th Amendment never talked about whether unauthorized immigrants were subject to the jurisdiction of the United States because illegal immigration didn't exist at the time. In fact, legal immigration didn't even exist. People came and they went. They naturalized or they didn't. It wasn't until the late 1800s, in fact, several decades after the 14th Amendment was ratified, that Congress started restricting immigration from certain parts of the world. And that's when we get the first, and so far only, Supreme Court ruling about how the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause applies to children of immigrants. It's called United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to Chinese parents who had come to the U.S. in the late 1800s before Congress cut off immigration from China. They had permission to live permanently in the United States, but
were not eligible for citizenship under the U.S. naturalization laws.
So if they could never be citizens, was their American-born son a citizen? Now, people expected the Supreme Court to say no, since there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment at the time.
But the court did not go that way. The court said that children of these resident aliens, even if they're ineligible for citizenship, are birthright citizens.
The majority of legal scholars today interpret that ruling from 1898 to mean that birthright citizenship applies regardless of the parents' immigration status. But technically, Wong Kim Ark's parents were in the U.S. legally, so far as the concept existed at the time. So does the ruling really apply to unauthorized immigrants today? Roger Smith thinks not. And that takes us back again to the phrase, subject to the jurisdiction. Supporters of unrestricted birthright citizenship come at this from the angle of legal authority. They say if an unauthorized immigrant can be charged with speeding and sent to traffic court, well, they're clearly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. If they can be deported, they are subject to the jurisdiction. Okay, says Roger Smith, but what about the Native Americans in 1868, who also had to follow local laws, and Congress said they were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States?
Why did the framers of the 14th Amendment want to exclude members of the native tribes? I don't think it's good that they did, but they clearly wanted to do that because they thought that the members of the tribes were people who were not giving full allegiance to the United States. Well, if you have people who are in the country in violation of the sovereign government of the United States and its laws and policies,
in other words, unauthorized immigrants,
then similarly, they can be seen as in defiance of the jurisdiction of the United States. There has been a refusal to comply with the laws of the country on the part of the people who have come, and the existing residents have not given their consent.
And so, says Roger Smith, unauthorized immigrants are not subject to the jurisdiction in the reciprocal way that phrase was intended, and their children are not clearly eligible for birthright citizenship. But he says just like Congress stepped in to grant birthright citizenship to members of Native American tribes in 1924, Congress can and should step in to clarify that, yes, children of unauthorized immigrants have birthright citizenship. In fact, that was the outcome Smith was actually hoping for when he and his co-author Peter Schuck published their book, Citizenship Without Consent, in 1985. It did not go as they hoped.
Our argument was seized on by people who were virulently anti-immigrant. Both Peter and I favor increased legal immigration. And it has, in fact, been a huge disappointment to me. So much so that in recent years, I have mostly not addressed the issue because I don't want to give aid and comfort to those seeking to alter the birthright citizenship rule. At the same time, I continue to believe that this is a question that the 14th Amendment does not clearly address, and that the best understanding of the 14th Amendment is that such questions should be decided by Congress. So lots of my friends want me to say I was wrong. I'm not comfortable saying that, but I am occasionally invited to speak out against the policy of birthright citizenship for unauthorized aliens, and I'm not comfortable doing that either.
Now, there is one aspect of this where Roger Smith and his mainstream legal and political science colleagues do agree.
I don't think that there's any plausible reading of the 14th Amendment that says the president gets to decide who a citizen is.
And it would be very surprising if the U.S. Supreme Court were to say that President Trump can, simply through executive order, reinterpret the 14th Amendment. But it's within the realm of possibility that the current Supreme Court, with a majority of justices who tend to interpret the Constitution more conservatively, could decide the 14th Amendment applies more narrowly than it has been interpreted in the past. Now, most legal scholars and civil rights advocates hope that will not be the case, and they would consider it a major departure from a century of court precedent. Abdi Soltani is in that group.
I'm executive director of the ACLU of Northern California.
And birthright citizenship is both professional and personal for Soltani.
I was born in Los Angeles, California in 1973. My parents are both from Iran. My dad had received a 6-month fellowship to the United States, and my mom and dad came together, and I was born towards the end of that fellowship. Their initial idea had been that my mom would come to the U.S. for only a portion of the fellowship, but then as time passed, it was too late for her to go back, and so I was born here in Los Angeles.
Soltani's parents returned to Iran after his birth, and then they fled during the Iranian Revolution and came back to the U.S. when he was 9. He wove his family's story into a book about birthright citizenship called The Meaning of Citizenship.
You know, it was like a surge of electricity for me to recognize that the source of my citizenship and its protection in the Constitution comes from the abolition of slavery. And I think that all of us as citizens of the United States need to really understand that legacy and that history and honor it and respect it, and also pay attention to issues of equality today with respect to race and other forms of inequality.
Abdi Soltani is now working on another book about birthright citizenship. And when I mentioned that I'd spoken to Roger Smith, he was tickled.
Oh, I love his books, and I've corresponded with him also by email. He's been very generous to reply to me.
But Soltani has come to a different conclusion about the meaning of that key phrase, subject to the jurisdiction. He, too, points to English common law. But where Smith argues that the American revolutionaries rejected the idea of perpetual allegiance in favor of a two-way street of mutual consent, Soltani thinks they only rejected the expectation of lifetime allegiance on the part of the people.
What's different than the English system is that we can choose to end our citizenship. At the time that the 14th Amendment was adopted, based on the values of consent and equality, there also was passed and created a law that gives you the process by which you can renounce your citizenship. So what I love about the combination of our constitutional system as well as the laws that enact those principles is full inclusion at the front door. You're a citizen. You're in. You're protected as a child, irrespective of your parents, and you can live your life here with the foundation of equality and opportunity. And we believe in these principles of Republican government, through which, as a citizen, you have a voice in that government, you have a vote, you can run for office, and still, we also have the way you can exit that citizenship, which was not an option under the prior birthright subjectship. It was not possible to leave being a subject of the king.
Furthermore, says Soltani, the context in which Congress first passed any law about birthright citizenship is crucial. Recall that until the end of the Civil War, it was largely assumed that any child born in the United States was a U.S. citizen, unless they were Black. And then, to address that specific problem, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The point was to expand access to birthright citizenship, not to draw the circle smaller, argues Soltani.
They overrode the president's veto and made that the law of the land. And Julie, they went further and put the same principles of equality in a constitutional amendment that was ratified by all the states 2 years later. So the reason that this was put in the Constitution was to, number one, protect it from a president like Andrew Johnson, or a president like Donald Trump today, and to protect it from a future Congress who, because of racial spite, racial animus, or other prejudicial or exclusionary principles, might want to chip away at that idea.
And then there's the Wong Kim Ark ruling, says Soltani. It may not have been specifically about birthright citizenship for children of unauthorized immigrants, but Supreme Court rulings are not just about the decision. The whole written opinion of the court, which is more than 50 pages in this case, becomes part of legal precedent.
It's really worth reading the whole decision. It has a fulsome history of birthright citizenship going back to English common law. And what it does then is it defines what is within the jurisdiction of the United States and what's outside. And it specifies the things that are outside are the Native American tribes, the children of ambassadors, and parts of the United States during occupation from like the armies of foreign governments, like which had happened during the War of 1812. That's it. Everyone else is within the jurisdiction of the United States, full stop. And I think if we learn something from the history of this country, Julie, is that the best of this country comes out on the side of equality and inclusion. And the parts of our history that we should really learn from for the caution that they provide is the ways in which inequality can really hurt the country in pretty big ways. The reason that I think at the end of the day, any person born in this country is better for all of us to be a citizen is that child with a birth certificate and a birth certificate alone is a citizen equal for the future of their life in this nation. And I think that we're all better served for that child to start their life in the United States on that footing of equality and inclusion that is the best of the United States.
Abdi Soltani is executive director of the ACLU of Northern California, a scholar of citizenship law, and recipient of U.S. birthright citizenship by right of soil. So we have tried to lay out over this last hour the perceived advantages, disadvantages, and the competing legal arguments around universal birthright citizenship in the United States. Here's something that's been on my mind as I've been trying to make sense of this debate. Maybe it'll be helpful to you too. It seems like we have a philosophical divide in this country over the meaning and importance of citizenship. If we think of it as a precious commodity, the most valuable thing we can bestow on a person, well, then we ought to guard it carefully, because the more freely we hand something out, the less valuable or meaningful it becomes. On the other hand, though, if we think of citizenship as the most important symbol we have of who we are, a nation rooted in freedom, opportunity, and equality, well, then we boost its value by granting it generously and taking seriously the responsibilities that come with it. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu. And by the way, if immigration and citizenship law are as interesting to you as they are to me, we've done a bunch of other Top of Mind episodes you might enjoy. Back in early 2022, we looked at why the right to vote is tied to citizenship and how some communities are allowing non-citizens to cast ballots. Also, we looked at the refugee resettlement system in the United States. That's a particularly timely one to listen back to now. And then in 2023, we did a deep dive into the role of immigration in addressing labor needs in some sectors of the economy. And we explored how asylum laws and international norms are affecting the situation at the U.S. border. You can check our show archives to find those episodes, and let me know what other topics you'd like us to be tackling here. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by me and Caleb Leach with help from Isabella Sosa, Samuel Benson, and Sam Payne. Our sound designer is Lauren Sandberg. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.